With all these rising utility costs right now, these homeowners can actually stay in their homes. They don't have to choose between paying the mortgage and utilities.
Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your questions answered, and contribute to the community dialogue. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our weekly Passive House Accelerator live webinars. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Welcome back to the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler, coming to you from Auckland in New Zealand, and I'm joined again this week by Zach Semke. How you going, Zach?
I'm well. How are you?
Good. And also joining us again, Ilka Cassidy. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you.
And we're going to, you've been around a little bit at some great events recently, Ilka. We're going back to May, where you were at the Sustainability Symposium. Just briefly, what is the Sustainability Symposium?
So I didn't have to travel very far for this one. It's a annual conference or a sustainability symposium, and it is hosted by Green Building United, which is the local organization here in Philadelphia, and it was at Temple University, which is basically 20 minutes down the road from me. So it was
Nice.
it was a very easy decision to go. And unless I'm not around, I go every year. It's definitely a highlight for me. Just I think I say it too. It's just very local. I know a lot of people. It's nice to see familiar faces, but it's also very high quality of presentations every year. There's
Yeah.
definitely a lot of activity here, and it's mostly presentations that are around or given by people from Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, or Delaware, or Maryland. So it's nice to see what is going on more locally.
Yeah. And I think it's great to hear from an event like that that's not necessarily full bore passive house, but what I did hear were people starting to think about or being challenged to think about doing things differently from the way they had. And I think that's in some ways even more influential because that's us reaching into a more mainstream, wider audience and challenging people just to think differently about the way that they've always built things. So yeah, there was a couple of instances of that listening to this. So yeah, looking forward to getting to that. But before we do, Zach, got a few people to thank.
We sure do. So I want to thank our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, as well as our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Ingwe Architecture, Partel, Rockwell North America, and Zola Windows. And thank you to our champion sponsors, Pugliese, Cascadia Windows and Doors, Icon Windows and Doors, Intis Windows, LG Air Conditioning Technologies, Proseco, Source 2050, and Zender.
Great. All right. Well, there's a series of guests or interviewees that you've got here that you recorded for us, Ilka. So I'll let you introduce them as we go. But these are your voices from the Sustainability Symposium.
Welcome to the Passive House Accelerator podcast, and we are at the Sustainability Symposium in Philadelphia right now. So I'm always super excited about this symposium because it's local, and it's just nice to see all these familiar faces, and every year it's just a really great event. So well, we're here. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Hello, my name is Rich Freeh. I serve as the Executive Director of Green Building United, and I'm joined here by Emily Pugliese, our Policy and Program Director.
Hi. Awesome. What I really like to talk talk about today is what is going on in Pennsylvania. So I feel like the symposium is such a great reflection of what is going on. There's so many great sessions. From your point of view, what's going on in Pennsylvania?
Sure. I'm happy to kick off, and we'll zoom out and probably zoom back in ultimately to Passive House as we go on. But zooming out, I think most folks who are listening to this podcast are probably a little bit familiar with Pennsylvania's political environment, right? If you are following elections, you see us seesawing back and forth. We're a blue state, we're a red state, we vote for this person, we vote for that party. And really you see that, at a political level, nationally at the state, but you also see it from a policy perspective. And so I think one of the things that is often both a challenge and an opportunity for us at Green Building United and our partners who work across the state is trying to identify those areas and opportunities for movement at a policy level in such a divided state. And to be candid, it's been challenging. The last couple of years, we have not seen significant movement in environmental policy in the state. There are a couple of exceptions, which we can certainly talk about. But I think overall, it's the environment is that environment of sort of, seesawing back and forth. And it makes it hard to do some of the big things that we and our members really do want to see happen.
And I think one of the things that we have seen happen that has been a little bit frustrating, but that we are planning to work on at the state level is some of the code adoption. So, that's base and that's not Passive House, but it's, we're already a little bit behind. So the state just adopted the 2021 standard. Just for reference, Delaware just adopted the 2024 IECC energy code. So we're again a little bit behind. And the process by which we adopt code in the state is a bit cumbersome, a bit confusing, and we think has room for improvement. So our focus in the near future will be to figure out how to change that process. So there's a technical advisory committee that reviews the upcoming codes and provides their technical advice. And then there's a review advisory committee that votes on that. That review advisory committee, you can actually apply to join. And I'm pretty sure that opens up in June. It goes for a month. So mid-June, I think, to mid-July to join that committee. But it's an important position and it really helps to determine the codes, the base codes in our state. And during the 2021 code adoption process, we experienced the commercial code passing very easily during the first day of voting, and then the residential code did not pass. So for the state of Pennsylvania, we are basically still at 2018 code. And there were some really important insulation requirements within that code and other efficiency requirements that would have been great to see across the state. So I think there's an opportunity there to, we were in Harrisburg just last week talking to some legislators, and there were people that were interested in changing that process or looking into it. So we will continue those conversations. And I think it's a great way also if you want to get involved in that advocacy to join Green Building United's Policy and Advocacy Committee. It's work that we're going to be doing over the next year.
Awesome. Thank you. So how about incentives? Because I know that Pennsylvania was pretty advanced a few years ago just through advocacy that Tim McDonald did, right? Where does it stand now? Is that still the same as years before, or did that roll back, or what was that even?
Yeah, sure. So I think the specific requirement that you're talking about, or really incentive, was part of the LIHTC application, which is the low-income housing tax credit, which is a federal tax credit administered at the state level through here, the Pennsylvania Finance Authority. And they sort of had, through that advocacy of Tim and other folks who were part of the Passive House community here in Philadelphia, which is, has become part of Green Building United, they really, pushed to have Passive House be included as a part of what's called the QAP, which is basically, if you're part of that, it makes it very advantageous to pursue those certifications to get the credits to get these LIHTC, projects through, which is what folks who are on the affordable housing, development side are trying to do, right? So that happened, but over time, what we've seen is other kinds of standards, which are still good, but not Passive House, have been added. So things like Enterprise Green and now some other have gotten in there. And so what we've seen is it's less advantageous now, certainly than it was probably in the mid-2010s. We are still seeing some projects, particularly on that large affordable multifamily side, pursuing passive house. I think there will be a couple that are announced pretty soon that we've heard are in the pipeline. But one of the other things that I think is really important to flag is, I think that's an incentive in one sense, but really what that was a sort of setting a standard and saying, if you want this funding, you have to do this thing, right? Another way to think about incentives is money that's actually available to help you pursue sort of a specific project. And one thing that we're hoping to see in the next couple of weeks, if not months, is the release of some federal funding for what in Pennsylvania is called the Penn Energy Savers Program. But this is really part of the Inflation Reduction Act that is funding that is available for home, multifamily electrification and renovations. And a really significant, I have the number in front of me, I'm sure we can find it, a really significant chunk of funding that would be available that wouldn't specifically say this is for LEED or this is for passive house or this is for living building, but would say, if you're trying to do a project where you're looking to do ground or air source heat pumps, you're looking to do, electrification, electrified kitchens, if you're looking to do solar EV charging, that those things could be covered under this funding. So those incentives we hope will still come to Pennsylvania and could really help unlock some projects that I think folks here want to see happen, right? Like, I think it's ultimately right now a challenge of passive house penciling. And I think that some of these incentives can help make that math work a little bit better than it has been over the last couple years.
Great, thank you. And is there anything specific to Philadelphia that can help push the movement forward a little bit better?
Yeah, so again, we'll go back to codes. I think that's where we are in the state and the city at this moment. So there is a bill in front of City Council to actually adopt the 2021 IECC energy codes for residential. It's all the things that we wanted in there that were left out of the state code, except one continuous installation provision that we think is really important. So we are doing some advocacy at the city level to get that put back in, either as an amendment or as a separate bill. So that work is happening. And then, there's continued advocacy at the city level to do a building performance standard, which was just in a great panel about BPS in Philadelphia. So we're hoping that advances in the near future.
Great. And I would add two pieces of sort of things that are happening here in Philadelphia that I think are ultimately relevant to this audience. The first is that last year, the Philadelphia City Council, with the mayor's office, passed an $800 million bond initiative for a program called HOME, or Housing Opportunity Made Easy. This is funding for a suite of housing programs in Philadelphia, some existing, some new, really aimed at bolstering the availability of affordable and close to market rate housing in the city. There are no efficiency or standards of any kind attached to HOME right now. So that is something that we are talking with the administration and with council right now to see, at the very least, if we can bring some of the insulation and efficiency requirements that have been left out of code, or even jumping to 2024, building that specifically into those HOME initiatives, if we're not able to sort of do that across all residential development in the city. So I think the HOME piece is one part. The other piece, which is happening in Philadelphia, but also happening in Pennsylvania, happening in the US, and happening across the globe, is this discussion around energy affordability, right? And sort of framing affordability as a crisis. So earlier this week, Emily and I were testifying at a Philadelphia City Council hearing on energy affordability with a number of other stakeholders. One of the stakeholders who was there was our excellent state rep, Elizabeth Fiedler from South Philly. And one of the things that she mentioned in her remarks, which was, we did not tell her to say this, but she, of her own volition, reminded City Council that every dollar that's spent on insulation, efficiency, on building standards is a dollar that is received back by the tenant or resident of that home, right? So that's something that everybody on this listening to this podcast understands, but not necessarily something that Philadelphia City Council members understand. So I think we're seeing really a moment emerging with this funding through HOME, with some of those state incentives that are available, And with this renewed interest in energy affordability to say, how can we go further than code? How can we look at things like a building performance standard? How can we look at higher level codes, looking at what we're seeing in Boston and Connecticut and other places? And are there opportunities for Philadelphia to not be left behind, but actually to reemerge as a leader? And so I think that's the conversation that we at Green Building United are having right now with a lot of our elected officials and policymakers in the city in particular right now. And I think that, again, to folks listening to this podcast, if you're in and around the Philadelphia area and you want to be involved in those conversations, we'd love to partner with you to do so.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, we're at the Sustainability Symposium in Philadelphia, and I'm here with Justin Lovenitti from New Ecology and Norm Horn from New Ecology as well. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Ilka. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you. What do you like about the symposium? Why do you, I've seen you here before. So why do you keep coming back? What's exciting for you?
For me, I think it's a good chance to see what other folks are up to in the region. I'm based in Baltimore, so I'm a little bit more focused in Maryland and Delaware. We do have some projects going on in Pennsylvania, but this is my best chance to kind of see what's happening in Philadelphia and kind of focus in on the Pennsylvania market a little bit more. So that I've always enjoyed coming because the sessions are informative and I see a lot of folks that I usually only catch up with once a year. So I appreciate seeing them as well.
Awesome. How about you, Norm?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite events for all those same reasons. It's just a great opportunity to see all the work that's happening regionally and to catch up with people.
So the reason I wanted to talk to you both is because you were both in really, really exciting sessions. I would say those were the two that were my favorites of the ones that I saw. Of course, there's always all these different tracks, right? And you're always kind of upset that you can't really see everything. But I was happy with the ones that I picked, the two that you were in. And I would like to talk about those. But maybe before we get into that, Justin, can you talk a little bit about what your position is at New Ecology and just roughly what you do within New Ecology?
Sure. New Ecology is a nonprofit organization. We're based in Boston, and we have around 50 folks working on the built environment and how we bring the benefits of sustainability to underserved communities. So we primarily work in affordable housing and other kind of community-focused projects. I work in the Baltimore office. I'm a senior energy engineer. I've been with New Ecology since 2019. So I work on the decarbonization team. So I mainly focus on existing buildings and bringing those up to current standards, trying to decarbonize, electrify, provide code level or better ventilation. So I do a lot of assessments of multifamily properties, and we do a lot of implementation work, primarily through one of the Energize Delaware programs that Norm can probably speak to a little bit more.
Norm, would you like to speak about that? Because your presentation was a lot about that program, right?
Yeah, we actually have two programs that we administer for Energize Delaware. So my role is I'm the Associate Director of Strategic Projects, which is kind of an appropriately vague title. For someone who's like I've made a career out of finding odd places to fit in and do my work there. The core of where I'm really at home is providing technical assistance to designers, developers, construction teams to deliver what's typically their first or second significantly above energy code project. So the one program that we administer for Energize Delaware is called Climate Smart Homes. And that's focused on the scattered site, single family, say non-LIHTC supported projects to do all electric, Energy Star, efficient new homes, program certified, both new and renovations. The other program that we administer for Energize Delaware is the Affordable Multifamily Housing Program, which provides technical assistance to new construction, typically like LIHTC projects, or like where Justin works in the existing building initiative, where you're doing decarbonization work, energy retrofits, capital upgrades, just general energy improvements to existing buildings.
Great. And can you explain the LIHTC incentives a little bit more?
So yeah, just it's a low income housing tax credit. So it's just a funding mechanism to provide affordable housing. And, many cases, the states have a requirement, or it's a somewhat competitive process where you use something like a green certification, say Energy Star, Efficient New Homes, Passive House is it's one that's gaining traction after a lot of publicity in Pennsylvania a couple of years ago, as a means of like collecting points to strengthen your application in the qualified allocation or QAP process that allocates those tax credits.
Great. And that is available in Pennsylvania, but also in Delaware and Maryland as well?
Yeah, pretty much every state has their own process. So we've got projects in PA, Delaware, Maryland, DC, that, as Norm mentioned, it's a very competitive process. So you're trying to put together the strongest application that you can. I think in Delaware, correct me if I'm wrong, Norm, there's usually like 4 projects or 5 projects that get awarded each year.
Yeah, 4 to 6. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's like a 9% tax credit, which is primarily for new construction projects. And then there's a 4% tax credit, which is exclusively for rehabs, like retrofits, basically. So we've done a little bit of both, but it's just a mechanism that the states use to promote affordable housing.
Mm-hmm. Great. And let's stay in Pennsylvania for now, and specifically in Philadelphia, because that is a project or a study that you worked on, Justin, right, with a group. And you talked about this in this awesome session that was called Closing the Funding Gap, Aligning Public Investment with Affordable Housing Preservation and Climate Resilience. So
Yes.
yeah, I mean, it sounds very promising. So I was very curious to hear what you all came up with, and yeah, would you like to explain who is behind it, who's part of the team, and what this study is about?
Sure. So a team of nonprofit organizations responded to an RFP from the city of Philadelphia, and we've specifically been working with PHDC in Philadelphia. They were interested in assessing the subsidized housing, affordable housing in the city that is not publicly owned, because they know there are a lot of shortcomings when you look at the climate readiness of the housing, the resilience of this housing, and also just the overall quality. So one thing that, was a recurring theme is that the housing stock in Philadelphia is very old, which is not unlike Baltimore or Wilmington, let's say. So it needs a lot of attention. And part of the funding really came out of some disaster relief funds that were provided to the city after Hurricane Ida hit about 10 years ago. I don't remember the exact date, and caused a lot of flooding. So the funding that they're looking to determine like how best to use is DR, Community Development Block Grant Disaster Relief, I think is the full acronym. So that's kind of like the foundation for the study that we did. New Ecology was one of the 4 team members. We worked also with Building Electrification Institute, BEI, Reinvestment Fund, and LISC Philadelphia to sort of build out the different phases of this study.
So great. And what did you look at? I mean, you had a lot of graphs and a lot of findings, and the level of detail that you went into was just amazing and so eye-opening. So can you tell us a little bit more about exactly what you looked at and what the results were?
Yes. So the first thing was really compiling different data sources from the city. Reinvestment Fund led that work. They are going to be publishing an affordable housing directory soon. As of this time. I'm pretty sure it is not available publicly, but it should be within this calendar year. So we took that data source. We took the inventory from the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency. We took information from the city's licenses and inspections department. So things around when permits were pulled for this housing, when violations were recorded. We looked at FEMA information, HUD, REACT scores, benchmarking data from GBU, well, really from the city, but, kind of like tied in with Green Building United. We looked at a sampling of capital needs assessments and also some data from the Office of Sustainability. And we kind of backfilled it with some American Housing Survey information through the census. So that gave us a snapshot of what types of buildings and developments comprise this subsidized affordable housing that is not publicly owned. So basically any city of Philadelphia property was excluded, anything through the Philly Housing Authority. We found that the scale of buildings ranges tremendously. There are scattered site single-family homes that are rental properties up to 50-plus unit high-rises. The number of buildings skew heavily towards the smaller scale. So single-family homes and 2 to 4 unit buildings make up around 1,900, 2,000 of the total, like 3,700 buildings. But when you look at units, actually most of them are in the large buildings. So of the close to 28,000 units that we studied, about 14,000 are in those 50-plus unit developments. And then we looked at conditions of these buildings from those data sources, trying to figure out, okay, what are the areas of need? There are accessibility concerns, health and safety concerns, especially around moisture, asbestos, lead, pests. We're looking at, how can the buildings be waterproofed appropriately for flooding resilience? How can they be ventilated properly? What are required for the building enclosure to upgrade durability? Everything from building systems to renewable energy to weatherization, energy efficiency measures. We kind of looked at the whole gamut to see, okay, what percentage of small buildings do we think need X, or what percentage of 25 to 49 unit buildings need Y? And through that process, we came up with 6 common building types and ultimately got to a suite of measures for each of those 6 building types.
That's great. And then you went a step further and actually looked at cost, right? So
yes.
that was amazing too, because a lot of studies kind of stop right there. But you said, okay, this is what we need. And then how much does it cost to do this? So what were your findings there?
Yes. The second part of the study was a funding gap analysis to understand with the existing programs, what can be accomplished and what actually, what are we missing? What projects really do not have the needed financing or funding to be accomplished? So that also ranged. So we looked at each typology from scattered site single family up to 50-plus unit high rise and everything in between. We basically assessed like an immediate needs package, which is just like to stabilize the buildings. Because again, some of these buildings, several of these buildings are over 100 years old already. Even the quote unquote newer buildings are often 1970 or before. So we looked at immediate needs, again, just focus on stabilizing, and then a comprehensive upgrade package, which was really around achieving electrification for the most part. I wouldn't say 100%. Dealing with the building deficiencies like improving health and safety, reducing the load, doing air sealing insulation upgrades, roof insulation, wall insulation, et cetera, foundation insulation, and then resilience upgrades as well. And what we found, so for the smaller buildings, it's the health and safety needs that really dominate. So the most expensive on a per unit cost is the single family style home, just because, there's so much to be done based on the age and the construction type. A lot of these buildings are mass masonry, not insulated. In the larger buildings, what we found was really the building systems drives the cost. Upgrading those, especially if you are electrifying, the infrastructure there is really dominating. Resilience was kind of a lesser cost just because we kind of factored in that in a lot of the other projects. So it's kind of inherent in some of those other upgrades.
Yeah. And then you had this big kind of spreadsheet, right?
Yes.
Your co-presenter. And maybe this is a good time to actually mention who co-presented with you, because everyone put a lot of time
Yes.
into this, right? So
Absolutely.
who did what?
Danny Mackus was the moderator from Building Electrification Institute, and she helped throughout just to really present the findings in a way that could be interpreted easily by people. It's a lot of data, as you said, and she was really excellent at distilling things into a few bullet points that could convey the important points. BEI also was responsible for defining the typologies, primarily responsible for that. So the 6 typologies that we studied. As I mentioned, Reinvestment Fund was primarily responsible for the data set. So there was a lot of back and forth trying to align records between different sources of information to make sure we had the right properties, the right data tied to the right properties. And that was Colin Weidig, who presented with us on the panel. And also we had help from Henry Feinstein at Reinvestment Fund as well. He was really critical in the process. And then Dan Swain from LISC Philadelphia. So LISC Philadelphia convened a bunch of working groups to get stakeholder input. So that was really interesting to bring folks in from all over the city. There were contractors, architects, other designers like structural engineers, mechanical engineers, resident rights groups. I'm probably missing developers, of course, and owner property managers. So LISC was really, they're tied into the community really well, and they could kind of convene these and where we could get direct feedback from the people who are really responsible for responding to these needs.
Yeah, great. So it's a very, very comprehensive study there. So the findings were quite interesting, like because there was a grid saying, okay, in these building typologies, this is how much money we need to get them all basically to where we want these buildings to be. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And there are different funds available for different housing typologies and for different measures. And you kind of looked at, okay, where is a gap and how big is it? So 1 or 2 housing typologies came out at 0. Which one was that?
The 25 to 49 unit properties, per our analysis, they may not have a gap. Obviously, every building is different. So we're kind of focusing in on a median scenario, but based on the funding that is available to that scale project, which all those sources may not be available to smaller buildings, that helps. And then I think the costs maybe per unit were slightly lower than in some of the other building types. And we used a representative building for each typology that was like around the typical age and typical construction and typical size. So there could be some economies of scale around, well, this building is, it's efficiently shaped, the ratio of exterior enclosure to the interior space is a little bit more efficient than other building types. That's another factor that came into play here. The other typologies, like the larger buildings, 50 plus, had smaller gaps that we identified, again, because there are more funding sources that might be available to those. The small buildings are the toughest case to make, especially the smallest building, the townhouse style, row house style. They have huge gaps, funding gaps, that they just don't qualify for as many sources. And as we talked about, the initial investment is very high.
Great. So moving forward, what are you going to do with all this information? Like how is it going to help the city of Philadelphia to, support the renovation or getting all those houses and housing typologies climate resilient?
Yeah. So from the recommendations that have been made, the city will determine kind of which they want to implement. So I think the findings will directly influence their RFPs that they put out, and with the hope of, kind of emphasizing the climate resilience aspects that we studied. There's also some funding, that disaster relief funding that I mentioned, that, there's a small, I won't say small, there's obviously this, we're talking about thousands of buildings. So not every building's going to be able to be addressed at this point in time, but there might be like a pilot project that comes from that, or a handful of pilots that come from that. So I think that could be an interesting outcome as well. I'm definitely not an expert, but the mayor of Philadelphia is also pushing a home initiative. It's an acronym so it's definitely a priority for city government to address affordability, especially in the housing sector. So I think that we've made some recommendations, and they're going to take those to heart. And the folks at DHCD, PHDC, they're going to be figuring out how they best think they can implement these ideas.
Yeah. And I think what I was also very impressed by is that you didn't just look at this in terms of, okay, what's going on right now, but you set it on a timeline, just saying, okay, all these housing typologies need that type of renovation or retrofitting next year, or in 2 years, or in 4 years. So, yes. And if I remember correctly, it was said that this is so important because there are certain funds available, right? So if you know that some kind of funding is running out in 2 years, you might want to prioritize, what needs to be done on those housing typologies right now. So again, very, very comprehensive, and looking forward. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a major concern. The idea that there's a lot of kind of expiring affordability covenants and things of that nature. So it's a critical time to preserve these units as achievable housing for the vast majority of folks. And yeah, I think there's something like more than 2,000 units which are expiring in the next decade. Mm-hmm. So that, I think that's the immediate focus, is what can be done to kind of like address those at highest risk. So that is one of the things that will be in the kind of final package, is looking at the timeline of when properties could be at risk of no longer being affordable housing.
Yeah. Well, amazing study. Norm, going from theory to practice, and what's working in Delaware through the Energize Delaware incentives, right? Because that's kind of what you presented on, and your presentation was called From Incentives to Impact: Partnerships that Make High Performance Affordable Housing Work. So also super interesting session. It was a panel discussion between you from New Ecology, and then who else was on the panel?
Yeah, so I was joined by Alan Mattis, who's the construction manager for Woodlawn Trustees, the Todd Worden Foundation, so an affordable housing developer here in Wilmington, and Drew Slater, who's the executive director of Energize Delaware.
Awesome. So can you explain what the project was, and how New Ecology got involved, and where the incentives came from, and all of the background?
Yeah. So, Climate Smart Homes is an Energize Delaware program that addresses affordability through energy efficiency in the non-regulated, or like I said earlier, non-tax credit funded segment of the market. So the original idea there was to provide gap funding that would help offset the incremental cost between building an all-electric, high-performance building that would cost no more to operate than just a gas-fueled, minimally energy code compliant, business as usual counterfactual. So the approach is really, it's based in passive house principles of prioritizing a robust building enclosure, of all the stuff that we're all familiar with, right? We're going to try to reduce heating and cooling loads, and then address those loads with efficient mechanical systems. So the specific elements that we were providing, funding for, and the technical assistance to implement, are significantly better than code airtightness, continuous insulation, better windows, high efficiency heat pumps for heating and cooling, heat pump water heaters, and of course, mechanical ventilation with heat recovery. So the project that we talked about was redevelopment of a block in Wilmington's east side that Todd Morton had taken control over. I believe there were previously like maybe 14 homes there. Now have 20 brand new townhouse style, all electric, Energy Star single family efficient new homes certified projects that they'll have HERS scores that range in the 36 to 38 range for renewables.
So during the panel presentation or discussion, Alan Mattis from Todd Morton Foundation was quite entertaining, right?
Yes, he was.
He told a little story that he didn't really know and wasn't really on board with all the green stuff, right? And that his boss just said, okay, we're going to get this funding, we're going to get these incentives, free money in a way, and we're going to do this. The only caveat is that New Ecology is going to be involved and it's going to be green. He talked about a lot of eye rolling and that he really wasn't too happy about it. So how was that? How was that to getting involved into something that was a little not well received in the beginning?
I mean, it was definitely a challenge. I've been used to projects where people or owners were highly motivated for whatever reason, to do some sort of above code certification or other building performance achievement. So this was a little bit different. I mean, it took a lot of work, a lot of meetings, talking with him and his team, and really bringing them up to speed on what we were going to be doing, what was proposed, and how it was different from what they normally do, and how it was the same as well, right? And like how it can be done without a lot of friction, for lack of a better word. I mean, I think where they were coming from was to them very new, very different, and they're used to an environment where things are pretty straightforward and familiar and repeatable. And this was certainly a kind of a shock to their system to do something above code like this.
Yeah, and he talked about it in a very positive way, though. So he definitely came around and he for sure was happy with the result because part of his story was also that he was called to one of the homeowners saying, here, I have $80 of utility bills a month. And for him, that was just incredible to see how, focusing on the envelope more than what he's used to, how that has a direct impact, like so direct to what the occupants, what their life is going to be. Really, he said, I'm converted because this, with all these rising utility costs right now, these homeowners can actually stay in their homes. They don't have to choose between paying the mortgage and utilities. So that was pretty amazing, an amazing testament to this whole process.
Yeah, that was an interesting story. And he and I were together. We went to visit this woman that he mentioned, and she said, "Oh, I don't know what to do. Like this utility bill, is so high. Like I'm not sure, what I can turn down to get it any better." We said, "Well, let's take a look at it." It was $80. It was for her first 2 weeks of living there, and this was during anyone who's in Philadelphia this winter remembers that we were like completely buried in ice and snow for like 2 solid weeks maybe, and it was in the 20s at best for that period. So it was in the midst of all that, and she had this $80 electric bill for 2 weeks, and fully half of it was just the delivery cost, not the cost of the energy itself. I said, well, I'm not sure what else you could do to get that down short of, like completely, pulling the plug, hitting the main breaker maybe. So I've not heard back from her after that. So I'm hoping that she's had, equally low bills now that we're touching the 90s here the last couple of days.
Yeah. And then they talked about what typical energy bills are like, and that is much, much higher for sure.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked with people who, they basically worry about this all year long, and they budget for the surprise spike bill in February that might be over $1,000, or the surprise spike that comes in July and August when the cooling, if they even have cooling, becomes $800 or $1,000.
Yeah. So you mentioned like you really had to work through like how to do this with the contractors on site. And one thing that you said that struck me was, instead of writing a note on the plans of saying, oh yeah, we expect this to be airtight or something, you said, how do you really, to be successful, you have to somehow convey how this works or how to do this on the plans, or with you being there. So it's not enough to just write a note somewhere. So how did you do this? How were you that successful? Because you also said that most of the homes after the blower door testing, you had an incredible low air leakage point, like comparable to passive house level, right?
Yeah. So like I said earlier, one of the key measures that we were, incentivizing and focusing on with the program was significantly better than code air tightness. So code asks for 3 ACH 50. We got a target of 1.5. So fully half of what code would require. And that's a tough number to hit. It's modest by passive house standards, but it's a tough one to hit in like a 1,400 square foot home, a small home, an attached home where you have demising wall assemblies that are notoriously leaky. And we're doing it with a contractor who never really had to focus on that level of air tightness before. So the thing that I find really compelling about the Climate Smart Homes program is that we're not just funding hard costs to the pieces of equipment or measures, but it's no cost technical assistance. So all of my time, all of my colleague Alex's time as a HERS rater, all of Justin's time helping us out with mechanical system questions on the back end, all that comes as part of the package. And so we're doing things that are significantly more involved than your standard energy consultant or HERS rater scope, if you'd even have an energy consultant on a project like this. So I was on site. I was at every biweekly OAC meeting for the course of the project. I was on site at least once, usually twice, if not 3 times a week, just checking in, saying hi, doing the walk around, look through. Had a really solid relationship with the site super, who really he helped me out a lot by being eyes on stuff that maybe he wasn't familiar with, but he knew when to call me and say, hey, I think you need to come down here and take a look at this just to make sure we're not doing something irreparable here. So we spent a lot of time, again, up front on this project working with the designers to make sure that things were codified in the drawings. And yeah, you're right. Like, how do you draw details that convey air tightness? It's not easy to do without being very prescriptive as a designer. So we made sure that every detail had something in there about maintaining the continuity of air control, or of course water management and thermal control, so that we had that as a teaching tool. So it wasn't just the compliance leg to stand on to meet the certification, but it was also the teaching tool we could always refer back to and say, hey, don't forget, like, this taping sequence is really critical to making sure that we hit this air tightness goal. And I mean, you've been there before. You know how challenging that can be, from like the first day that you put a shovel in the ground up until when you have all of your envelope components in place and you can do that first midpoint air tightness test and see where you're at. Mm-hmm. So we did a midpoint on all the homes that we did, and spent a lot of time with, with just us and with the installation contractor who largely owned air sealing, to make sure that we had gotten as many gains as we possibly could and weren't leaving anything on the table at midpoint that we could never go back for and easily capture at finals. So we knew we were in good shape at midpoint, and we kind of calculated, we didn't have to hit that 1.5 target. We got close, and in many cases we got below it at midpoint. But by the time we hit the finals, our project average air tightness over all 20 homes was under 1 ACH 50. And if you look at it by the surface area method, all 20 beat the FIAS new construction standard of 0.06 CFM 50.
That's amazing. And he also talked about like how, just like how did you achieve it and the cost of that, right? So the incentives were, I believe, 17,000 per unit. Is that correct?
Yeah, the hard cost incentive is 17,000 per home.
Yeah.
Again, that covers it's intended to sort of take the sting out of the cost differential between a code minimum baseline and doing continuous insulation, better windows, high efficiency heat pumps, mechanical ventilation, heat pump water heaters, and air sealing.
Yeah, and you were successful, right? So the developer kept saying, well, we were in 16,000 and we had a little bit of money even to spare. So that's quite amazing that worked out, that the incentives really covered the extra cost of doing these measures.
Yeah, again, like going back to some of those early conversations that I had with Alan and his team, it was the exercise of, doing takeoffs based on the plans, assigning, a unit cost to what, bare zip sheathing or, even house wrap and commodity OSB would cost versus doing the Zip R product that we used to cover the continuous exterior insulation and a large part of our air sealing success. And, showing them what the difference between a $300 vinyl builder grade window might be, and how we could put a couple extra dollars into the project to get a better window.
Yeah.
Right. So spent a lot of time trying to work that out with those guys ahead of time. And yeah, I think by virtue of having 5 homes per building, the scale worked out well for us on things like windows and sheathing. As far as just covering the cost differential for the equipment, that was pretty straightforward. Where it got squishier was the labor. And I think in a lot of cases, what happened was the initial pricing that came back from the contractors about, what the difference between their code compliant set of documents was and the set with our scope in it, they had kind of undershot what the labor investment was going to be. So, we were able to go back and, for example, make the framers whole on a lot of like overruns that they had, because, it was on the drawings, that they owned, a band of fluid applied sealant at the sill joint. They hadn't picked that up, right? And they certainly didn't pick up, what that costs per tube and the time it would take to do that, because, they're framers. They're not used to being asked to do air sealing. It's typically like compartmentalized, excuse the pun, into the insulator's scope. Those guys come in and they do their 1-part gun foam and caulking routine, and that's it, right? So the framers had a big hand in air sealing and, paying a close attention to following, all the zip details for taping and installing windows and making sure that everything was tight at the rough-in stage. So, fortunately, we were able to go back and keep everyone satisfied. And I think it's important that people, when they come onto a project like this, if it's their first one, that they leave with a good taste in their mouth, and not feeling like they need to go sell a kidney to offset their losses, right?
Yeah. Awesome. Well, it was certainly great to hear success stories. And I guess Justin and Norm, is there anything exciting you see in Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland in terms of incentives or any kind of policies that are coming up in a positive way?
I think the building energy performance standards, Norm alluded to one of the sessions that was earlier at the Green Building United Symposium. So I think that's something that we've seen, in DC for a few years now and in Maryland currently. Just the idea that we need to focus on building emissions. It's a major component of the carbon that we emit. And, we can do a lot better. We can also save a lot of money. So I think that's kind of one of the major policy changes I've seen over the last few years. And I'm sure there's other jurisdictions looking at it, maybe not currently in the Mid-Atlantic that I know of, but I'm sure it can't be far behind that other local jurisdictions will adopt those.
I mean, I would just say that we have some incredibly rich incentives for a small state here in Delaware for both new construction and renovations and energy efficient, affordable housing.
Yeah,
some of those. Great. I'm really excited about the potential that the program like Climate Smart Homes has to prepare construction teams to meet increasingly stringent energy code requirements, which we're moving toward the 2024 IECC. And I mentioned in our presentation that there was legislation in Delaware that would have required all new residential construction to be net zero energy capable by the beginning of the calendar year that we're in now. And they missed hitting that legislation, and a big reason for it was lack of preparedness in the trades. And something like Climate Smart Homes, I think, points directly to solving that problem and providing the technical assistance that teams need to understand this and get an early win under their belts, rather than struggling to meet mandates.
Really great series of interviews there. Anything particular that jumped out for you as a general theme or a highlight?
Well, I mean, everyone was great to talk to, and those sessions were just really, really great sessions with Norm and Justin. But I also really enjoyed talking to Rich and Emily just to see what we can, how we can get involved and how all of those incentives and programs and pushing the code kind of really works together, and how important it is to go to those lawmakers and raise awareness of what it means to have insulation on a building, because they're not typically, they don't really know what that means, right? So going there and just explaining here, it really comes down one-to-one to what you have to pay for utilities, and it has a huge impact. So it is important to, when we look at those programs, to include those requirements in terms of insulation or electrification, all of that. I just think it's amazing to just hear the background, what's going on in the background to push the code or to support what can be done.
Yeah. There was a lot of talk about codes and local codes, the international, the IECC, International Energy Code, and pushing those boundaries, the different dates of those codes. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting. But also the money, huge amounts of tax credits talked about, tax credits for affordable housing, and then these other really big incentives coming out of Delaware, which is pretty amazing. And just having a look through Energize Delaware, a huge number of resources, financial resources across all different sectors, not just construction, but everything from solar to weatherization. And some of it is loans, but a lot of it's grants and subsidies and actual free money for doing better, which is really impressive and quite exciting that a place like Delaware seems to be really punching above its weight in terms of what it's offering as a leg up to the industry. And another organization that was mentioned was the Building Electrification Institute, which is quite exciting to know that exists and is a thing and seem to be doing quite a lot of really cool work in that space as well, as people look at getting off gas and moving towards electrification. So it seems like there's some really positive work being done across the whole sector there. Zach, what were your highlights?
Yeah, really great stuff. I was struck by Rich Freeh's statement that there's like a seesaw. They that in Pennsylvania, that some one moment it's red, another moment it's blue, and that also translates to policy. And 8 to 10 years ago, there was a sort of a golden moment for the low-income housing tax credits and incentivizing passive house. And it was really the first time that model had been used, and was pretty revolutionary and had a really big effect on, honestly, the global passive house movement, definitely the North American one, because we could see, there's this, it sparked this explosion of passive house development, multifamily projects, and also proved out that these are not super expensive. In fact, after a couple of years of learning, they were getting to be at cost parity with conventional construction. So there was like this moment, and then the policy changed, as was mentioned in the interview, and passive house became less kind of like the ticket for these developers, and it was not as so it became less kind of common in these projects. And so that, on the one hand, is a downer. On the other hand, I guess there are two things that I really took away from the conversation. One is that that explosion of passive house, or I don't know, that explosion is a weird word, but you know what I'm saying, had a ripple effect elsewhere. And probably part of the reason that we see the progress in places like Massachusetts is because of the groundwork that was laid in Pennsylvania. And so that has durable, lasting impact. But the second is that there are folks like Green Building United and others who are working to continue to make progress in the state and can build on that success. There are built examples of passive house projects they can point to, but they also are doing the hard work of grappling with in code meetings and doing the advocacy and looking, establishing incentive programs and all that. So yeah. I was really heartened to hear about those programs and those efforts that are happening there. So
I think that's a really good point, Zach, because those code meetings, they take a long time. And it's still important work, and I guess it sometimes feels frustrating for us that it's such a slow-moving thing. And people were referencing, there was references in this to the 2018 codes, and some jurisdictions still being stuck in older codes. And it can be frustrating sometimes when we want people just to see that where things are moving and just get there faster. But counter to that, it's exciting to see that parts of the industry are moving much faster than those codes, and particularly when you add electrification in that, and then you get developers seeing the real financial benefits of doing better, and then that almost drags the code up by the market moving ahead of it rather than the market waiting until the code is changed. I mean, there's a bit of both. There's the two, there's a whole spectrum in the market, but it's good to see that I often feel like we need to, our work is in improving the codes, but I lose sight sometimes of the fact, or realize that there are great examples of people who are already well beyond the code, and the code is just one end of that spectrum. So yeah, work being done on all fronts. And
that's right. Yeah. And I mean, and thanks in part to groups like New Ecology. So it was great to hear from Justin and from Norm. And Norm Horn, it was also really fun to learn about what Norm is up to now. Norm was like original gangsta of the Passive House Accelerator, the global Passive House Happy Hour in the depths of COVID. And like I always knew I would be able to hang out with Norm on Zoom when those happy hours were happening. And now to see the work that he's doing in this position of leadership at New Ecology, and and taking the ideas of Passive House practice and applying them in these programs with the $17,000 incentive, not necessarily using the label Passive House, but just the good ideas of continuous installation and reducing the size of mechanicals, all that stuff. Yeah, it's really cool.
Getting
really
close
cool.
to the air tightness requirements is getting right down there. It's amazing what happens when you make your insulation contractor responsible for the air sealing.
Good stuff.
Any final thoughts from you, Ilka?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's just, again, I think just going back to those two sessions that we talked about, I mean, they were just, yeah, both really impressive. And I think the session that Norm was in, the best part was really, to see how the developer just got converted. He got in there really, really skeptical. He was like, well, I mean, he was kind of a very entertaining guy. And he was like, well, I just did it because my boss likes free money, and that was free money. And we kind of signed up. And then, all of a sudden it was like, well, but it's green, and then what does that even mean? And I think in the beginning, there was actually quite a bit of tension there. And then to see him there and really, explaining his experience and saying I'm converted because now I can I have these people move in and I know they don't have to choose between paying their mortgage or their utilities anymore. And I think that really, really convinced him. And once you do it once and you see it work, I mean, it's great, these incentives, and that they actually had almost some left over at the end, right? It's pretty amazing to see. And then the other session with Justin was just also so impressive, what the city of Philadelphia is doing in terms of looking at the electrification and making all the buildings that are up for renovation better, right? And what does it take? And going as far as looking at all these buildings across different types, different sizes, seeing what is missing, pricing it out, seeing what the funding is there, and then going into like, okay, what does that mean for us in the future, and what kind of renovation do we have to prioritize because we have funding until this and this year. So I think that was very impressive for sure.
That was a really powerful story of the tenants with the $80. And what strikes me is there'll be people out there that's an insignificant amount of money, but when you're dealing with people who that's literally a life-changing experience to be able to suddenly be able to pay both the mortgage and keep them and their family warm in winter and comfortable in summer, it is life-changing. And that's the level of affordability or unaffordability that a lot of people have been dealing with. And by virtue of good design and good construction, you can have that life-changing impact on people, and it is significant for someone, you're giving them that opportunity to actually live a decent life. So I found that really powerful, and it's a really good reminder of where some people are coming from and what the need is out there, and the potential impact that we will have. Really great stuff. Thank you, Ilka. Thank you for taking the long 20-minute journey down the road, for bringing us all those excellent on-the-spot interviews. Zach, what have we got coming up? Is there stuff coming up? We're heading into holiday time for you guys.
Yes, there is. This week is the finale of the 2025-2026 Passive House Accelerator live season. So June 24th is because we take July and August off, and then we'll kick off a new season in September. So June 24th is the last Passive House Accelerator live of the season, and it is a special one. It will feature reports from our Reimagine Labs, this spring edition. So we have these spring labs that have been meeting for the last couple of months. These are think and do tanks inside the Reimagine Buildings Collective, where small groups of 5 to 7 people are co-creating solutions around tricky decarbonization and resilience problems together. And so we're going to hear the insights that they have to share. So we're hearing from the Retrofit Cookbook Lab, the Construction for Deconstruction Lab, the Office to Residential Conversions Lab, the Nature-Based Performance Lab, the Active Survivability Lab, and the Selling Passive House in a Time of Insecurity Lab. So we'll hear brief, pithy reports from each of those, and then have a fun conversation at the Passive House Accelerator Live. So I share that for 2 reasons. One is I encourage people to tune in and join Zoom for that event. And also, if you're interested in being part of the summer labs, we have Reimagine Summer Labs happening in the Reimagine Buildings Collective. Check it out. Visit reimaginebuildings.com. You can join the collective. We'd love to have you. Lots of fun stuff happening in the collective, including these labs. So good stuff.
That sounds like a great one not to miss, the finale of the season, and some really great, go check out all the results and hear what people have been up to. That sounds like some really great stuff. Awesome. Thank you very much. We will be back again, though, next week. So great to chat with you both. Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Ilka. And tune in again next week for the Passive House Podcast.